The light from 1,000 beeswax candles danced across the vaulted ceilings of the grand hall, catching in the facets of crystal goblets and the intricate gold threads of courtiers' attire. It was a symphony of opulence, a scene of such dazzling splendor that it was meant to overwhelm, to remind every soul present of the unassailable power of the Elysian throne. Laughter as delicate and brittle as spun sugar mingled with the strains of a string quartet and the clink of silver on porcelain. From her seat of honor to the right of the king, Elara Vance was the silent center of this glittering universe, the newest and brightest star in the royal firmament. To the untrained eye, she was the epitome of serene grace. Clad in a gown of sapphire silk that deepened the violet of her eyes, her dark hair upswept in a cascade of elegant curls, she presented a mask of placid beauty. Her smile was a subtle, knowing curve of the lips, her posture impeccable. She was the king's new favorite, the woman who had captured the monarch's notoriously fickle attention, and for that she was both envied and feared. The lords and ladies of the court watched her with a mixture of admiration and calculation, their whispers following her like the rustle of silk. They saw a woman who had won the ultimate prize. They saw a triumph. They did not see the cage. Beneath the fine silk, a cold dread coiled in the pit of her stomach. It was a constant companion, a phantom chill that no amount of royal favor could warm. It was the poison. Not a substance of swift and merciful death, but a creeping, insidious thing that Lord Valerius called his assurance. A single drop administered once a month with its so-called antidote kept her tethered to his will, a beautiful gilded puppet whose strings were held by the king's own uncle. Every polite smile was a lie, every graceful nod a performance. Her heart beat not with excitement, but with the steady, chilling rhythm of a clock counting down to a vengeance she had sworn on her mother's grave. Her eyes drifted to the head of the table where King Theron sat. He was younger than the portraits in the grand gallery, suggested with a lean strength to his frame and hair the color of burnished gold. Tonight he seemed entirely captivated, his gaze rarely leaving her. He would lean in to whisper some light-hearted observation, his breath warm against her ear, and the court would sigh collectively at the display of royal infatuation. They saw a young king lost in a woman's beauty, a ruler softened by affection. Elara saw the glint in his eyes, a sharpness that his easy smile could not quite conceal. She saw the way his fingers, though loosely holding his wine goblet, were never truly at rest. He was playing a part just as she was. The question that haunted her waking moments and stalked her dreams was simple. Who was deceiving whom? A courtier proposed a toast to the king's wisdom, and Elara raised her glass with the others, the heavy crystal cool against her fingertips. The sweet, cloying scent of the arbor red wine filled her senses, and for a heart-stopping moment she was no longer in the grand hall. She was back in the cold stone library of her father's estate, the air thick with the smell of rain and betrayal. The memory came unbidden, as sharp and cruel as a shard of glass. 3 months ago. The storm had been relentless that night, rattling the window panes as if demanding entry. She had been in her mother's chambers reading aloud from a book of old legends, her mother's frail hand resting on hers. Lyanna Vance had been wasting away for weeks, succumbing to a sudden, inexplicable illness that baffled the finest physicians in the capital. "He will be home soon," her mother had whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Alistair, he promised." Elara had nodded, forcing a smile she did not feel. Her father, Senator Alistair Vance, had been away for days, locked in meetings with Lord Valerius, the king's uncle, and the true center of power in the kingdom. The heavy oak doors to the library had slammed open, and her father stood there, his fine clothes soaked with rain, his face a mask of grim determination. He was not alone. Behind him, draped in shadows, was the imposing figure of Lord Valerius himself. He moved with a predator's silent grace, his dark eyes sweeping the room before settling on her mother, who was struggling to sit up in her bed. "Alistair!" Her mother had breathed a flicker of hope in her tired eyes. "You've returned." "I have," Senator Vance said, his voice devoid of all warmth. He did not move toward his wife. He stood by the door, a sentinel guarding the entrance to a tomb. It was Valerius who approached the bed. He was a man who commanded attention without ever raising his voice. His face, handsome in a severe, chiseled way, revealed nothing. "Lady Lyanna," he said, his tone one of polite, almost clinical sympathy. "Your husband has served the kingdom well. His loyalty has been noted." "My daughter," Lyanna whispered, her gaze finding Elara. "Protect her." That is precisely why I am here, Valerius had replied. He produced a small silver vial from within his velvet cloak. The senator's final act of service requires a transition, a new chapter, and every new chapter requires a pledge of loyalty. His eyes shifted to Elara, and she felt a cold dread unlike anything she had ever known. "What is this?" Elara demanded, stepping in front of her mother protectively. Her father spoke for the first time, his words like stones. "It is necessary, Elara, for the good of the family, for your future. Your mother became an obstacle," Valerius explained calmly, as if discussing a matter of state ledgers. "She knew too much about our arrangements. Her sentimentality was becoming a liability." He looked at the frail woman in the bed with utter detachment. "A liability that has now been resolved." The truth crashed down upon Elara with the force of a physical blow. The illness, the sudden decline, it wasn't a sickness. It was poison, administered by her own father. Before she could scream to fight, Valerius's guards had seized her. They were brutally efficient, pinning her arms to her sides. Valerius himself took her chin in his cold fingers, forcing her head back. "Do not mistake this for cruelty, child," he murmured, bringing the silver vial to her lips. "This is an investment. You have your mother's beauty, but I pray you have your father's ambition. You will serve a great purpose." He forced the liquid down her throat. It was bitter and cold, and it felt like swallowing death. A slow-acting poison. An exquisite blend. "The antidote which I alone possess will be delivered to you each month, so long as you remain useful. Your first task will be to win the king's heart, and then you will help me break it." He released her, and she collapsed to the floor, choking the world spinning. Through her tears, she saw her father draw a dagger. He moved toward her mother, who could only watch her eyes wide with the final horrifying understanding of the man she had loved. "No," Elara shrieked, but a guard held her fast. Her mother's last gaze was not on her husband, but on her daughter. Her lips formed a single silent word: "Run." Then with a final ragged breath, she spoke, her voice just strong enough for Elara to hear. "Trust. No. Man." Her father had done the deed quickly, clinically. A single efficient stroke. He turned away from the bed without a second glance, his face unreadable. Valerius had pulled Elara to her feet. "Your grief is a powerful tool," he had said, his voice a cold whisper in her ear. "Use it. Let it forge you into the weapon I require. Now you are mine." "My lady," the voice brought her back to the blinding light of the grand hall. It was Lord Armitage, a portly man with sweat beading on his brow. "His Majesty has asked for you." Elara blinked, the horrific memory receding like a dark tide, leaving behind the cold, hard shore of her resolve. She offered the man a serene smile. "Of course." The low hum of conversation in the hall quieted as she rose. Every eye was upon her as she made her way toward the dais where the king waited. Her steps were measured, her movements fluid, a picture of perfect courtly grace. She was a weapon, Valerius had said, and he had been right. She was a blade sharpened by grief, honed by hatred, and pointed at the heart of the very men who thought they controlled her. She would play their game, win the king's heart, and then she would burn their world to the ground. She reached the throne and curtsied low, the sapphire silk of her gown pooling around her on the marble floor. "Your Majesty," she murmured, her gaze demurely fixed on the ground. "Rise, Lady Elara." King Theron's voice was smoother than she expected, a rich baritone that seemed at odds with his languid posture. She lifted her head, meeting his eyes. They were a startling shade of green, like moss in a sunlit forest. And in their depths, she saw it again, the sharp, assessing intelligence that he kept so carefully hidden behind a veneer of youthful charm. The infatuation was there, yes, a genuine spark of it. But it was accompanied by a piercing curiosity that seemed to see past her gown, past her smile, all the way to the poisoned heart within. He extended a hand and she placed her own in it. His skin was warm, his grip firm. "The court is enchanted by you," he said, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "They say you are a rare jewel, a treasure for the kingdom." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, a gesture that was both intimate and possessive. "But I have always found that the most beautiful treasures are often brought from distant, dangerous lands. And they always come with a price." A shiver, entirely involuntary, traced its way down her spine. His words were a silken arrow aimed with unnerving precision. He smiled, a slow, lazy curve of his lips that did not reach his eyes. For the first time since her mother's death, Elara Vance felt a flicker of something other than hatred and the thirst for revenge. It was a cold, thrilling spike of fear. The game had begun, and she was suddenly terrifyingly unsure of the rules. The chambers King Theron had bestowed upon Elara were a testament to his favor, a suite of rooms so lavish they were whispered to have once belonged to his grandmother, the legendary Queen Seraphina I. Sunlight streamed through arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting a golden sheen over everything. The furniture was of polished mahogany and fragrant cedar. The carpets were thick Kashkai silk that muffled her footsteps, and the air was scented with winter roses from the royal glasshouses. Gifts arrived daily, an endless procession of velvet-lined boxes borne by silent servants. There were ropes of pearls that felt cool and heavy in her hands, bolts of silk from the distant Jade Empire, and first-edition books of poetry bound in soft leather. Elara accepted them all with the same serene, grateful smile she wore for every occasion. She would thank the servants, admire the gifts for the appropriate length of time, and then, once alone, place them aside. They were not offerings of affection to her. They were adornments for the cage. The pearls were no different from the poison that flowed through her veins. Both were beautiful, and both were chains. She would catalog each gift, assessing its value, its potential use. The jewelry could be a bribe, the silks, a disguise, the books, a source of hidden knowledge. In her mind, nothing was simply what it appeared to be. Her training had been brief but brutal. After Valerius had taken her, he had sent her to a retired courtesan, a woman named Madame Evangeline, who lived in a secluded manor by the sea. For 3 months, Evangeline had stripped away the naive girl Elara had been and remolded her. She learned the art of conversation, the subtle language of the fan, how to dance, how to sing, how to move with a grace that drew the eye. But the most important lessons were in the art of manipulation. Men of power are hunters, my dear Evangeline had told her, her voice as smooth and worn as sea glass. They crave the thrill of the chase. That which is easily won is little valued. You must be the rarest of birds, the one they see but cannot quite catch. Let him see your wings, but never let him believe he can clip them. It was this lesson she put into practice now. An invitation arrived on perfumed parchment, sealed with the king's own signet, a private ride through the royal woods. It was a significant gesture, an offer of intimacy away from the prying eyes of the court. Elara penned her reply on her own simple, elegant stationery. She wrote of her immense gratitude, her profound regret, but a sudden and persistent headache, a lingering frailty from her sheltered upbringing, made the prospect of a ride impossible. She hoped His Majesty would understand. He would. The court buzzed with the news of her refusal. Duchess Seraphina, who had held the king's favor for the better part of a year, was said to be triumphant. "The little mouse is scared," she announced loudly in the queen's rose garden, her voice carrying to her circle of fawning ladies-in-waiting. She knows she cannot compete once the novelty wears off. But the king did not react with anger as Seraphina had hoped. Instead, he seemed more intrigued than ever. A second invitation arrived, a private supper in his personal observatory, a place few were ever permitted to enter. Again, Elara refused this time, citing a recurring fever, a delicate constitution that could not abide the night air. With her refusal, she sent a small hand-picked book of star charts, a token to show her thoughts were with him. The response was not another invitation, but the arrival of the royal physician himself, a wizened old man named Master Valerius, who clucked over her with genuine concern. He took her pulse, examined her tongue, and prescribed a regimen of rest and herbal tonics. Elara played the part of the fragile patient perfectly, her voice soft, her movements languid. She knew the physician's report would go directly back to the king, painting a picture of a woman of ethereal, almost tragic delicacy. A woman who needed protection. A woman who was not a threat. It was a week after the banquet that she finally decided to venture out. She chose her moment, carefully arriving at the Queen's rose garden in the late afternoon, when the light was soft, and the ladies of the court were at their most indolent, gathered on marble benches to trade gossip like currency. Dressed in a simple gown of pale lilac, with no jewelry save for a single silver locket that had been her mother's, Elara was a vision of modest elegance. Duchess Seraphina was holding court near the central fountain. She was a stunning beauty with fiery red hair and a spirit to match. Her laughter was loud, her gestures grand, and she wore her confidence like the priceless rubies that adorned her throat. When she saw Elara, her green eyes narrowed, and she rose, moving toward her with the deliberate grace of a stalking cat. Lady Elara Serafina purred, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How brave of you to venture out. I had heard you were confined to your chambers with a mysterious ailment." Her ladies giggled behind their fans. "You are too kind to worry for me," Duchess Elara replied, her voice calm and even. She gave a slight curtsy. "The royal physician assures me it is nothing more than a passing weakness." "A weakness," Serafina repeated, circling Elara slowly. "Yes, I can see that. You have a certain fragility about you. Men sometimes find that appealing for a time. They mistake it for innocence." She stopped in front of Elara, her smile sharp. "But a kingdom is not run on fragility, is it? It requires strength, resilience, a certain fire." It was a direct challenge, an accusation of weakness, and a boast of her own superiority. The surrounding ladies leaned in, eager for the confrontation. Elara did not flinch. She met the Duchess's fiery gaze with one of cool, unruffled serenity. "I have always believed true strength does not need to announce itself so loudly," Duchess Elara said softly. "A forest fire is powerful, it is true, but it consumes everything in its path and leaves only ash. A river is quiet, but its persistence can carve through mountains." A ripple of surprise went through the onlookers. The insult was so subtle, so elegantly delivered, that it took a moment to land. Serafina's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. She had expected tears, or a flustered retort. She had not expected philosophy. "How clever!" Serafina hissed, her composure cracking. "You hide your ambition behind pretty words. But I see you for what you are, a provincial nobody clawing her way to a position she does not deserve." She took a step closer, a servant following with a tray of wine goblets. Serafina took one, her hand trembling slightly with rage. "You should return to the countryside, little mouse. The air in the capital is too rich for your delicate lungs." As she spoke, she gestured dismissively, and the goblet of deep red wine accidentally tilted, its contents cascading down the front of Elara's pale lilac gown. Gasps echoed through the garden. It was a blatant, unforgivable act of public humiliation. Serafina watched, a cruel, triumphant smirk on her face, waiting for the explosion. But it never came. Elara looked down at the dark red stain spreading across the delicate fabric, and then looked back at Serafina. Her expression not of anger, but of gentle, sincere concern. "Oh, my dear Duchess," Elara said, her voice full of pity. She reached out and placed a hand lightly on Serafina's arm. "Your hands are trembling so. It must be the strain of your duties. You are overwrought." She turned to one of Serafina's own ladies. "Quickly fetch the Duchess a seat. She is not well." The sheer audacity of the move left everyone speechless. Elara had not only refused to be the victim, she had recast Serafina as the one who was hysterical and unwell. The Duchess was so stunned she could not form a coherent response. She could only sputter, her face a mask of incandescent fury. "And who precisely is not well?" The voice, cool and laced with authority, cut through the tension like a knife. King Theron stood at the edge of the garden path, flanked by two of his personal guards. He must have been approaching for some time, silent and unobserved. His eyes took in the scene in an instant: the spilled wine, the dark stain on Elara's gown, her look of calm concern, and Serafina's barely controlled rage. "Your Majesty," Serafina stammered, curtsying deeply, the fury in her eyes instantly replaced by a panicked attempt at charm. "We were just—" "Lady Elara had a small accident." The king's gaze moved to Elara. "Is that so, my lady?" Elara curtsied, her own movement a study in grace. "It was nothing, Your Majesty. A clumsy moment, that is all. The Duchess has been under a great deal of stress. I fear her nerves are frayed." It was a masterstroke. She had given him the perfect narrative, one that painted her as magnanimous and forgiving, and Serafina as unstable. The king's expression hardened as he looked at the Duchess. The flicker of disappointment in his eyes was more devastating than any public rebuke. "Perhaps, Duchess," the king said, his voice dangerously soft, "you should follow Lady Elara's advice and retire to your chambers. The court can be taxing." Without another word to Serafina, he turned to Elara and offered her his arm. Walk with me, Lady Elara. The air here has become rather unpleasant. As he escorted her away, leaving a humiliated and seething Duchess Serafina in their wake, Elara allowed herself the smallest, most private flicker of triumph. Phase 1 was complete. Later that evening, she was in her chambers dismissing her maids for the night. She stood before a tall, silver-framed mirror staring at her own reflection. The gentle, fragile woman the court saw stared back at her, but her eyes were cold, her mouth set in a hard line. The victory in the garden felt less like a triumph and more like a necessary sordid transaction. She was becoming the creature Valerius wanted her to be, and the thought left a bitter taste in her mouth. A soft knock came at her door. Thinking it was a maid with the sleeping tonic she had requested, she called enter. The door opened, but it was King Theron who stepped inside alone. He was dressed not in royal finery, but in a simple dark tunic and trousers, looking more like a scholar than a king. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, his voice quiet. "I wish to ensure you had recovered from this afternoon's unpleasantness." "You are most considerate, your majesty," she said, curtsying automatically. He waved a hand, dismissing the formality. "Please, in private, let us be Theron and Elara." He did not approach her, but moved to the window looking out at the moonlit gardens below. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, yet charged with unspoken questions. "Serafina can be passionate," he said at last, still not looking at her. "She feels threatened by you." "I have no wish to threaten anyone," Elara replied, her voice a carefully constructed whisper. "Don't you?" He turned then, and his green eyes seemed to pierce the shadows of the room. He took a few steps toward her, stopping just out of arm's reach. "Everyone in this palace wants something, Elara. Power, influence, wealth, security. To pretend otherwise is the greatest lie of all." He studied her face, his head tilted. "My uncle Lord Valerius speaks very highly of your father. He says the senator is a man who understands the true nature of power." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me, Lady Elara, what is your opinion of power?" The question hung in the air, sharp and deadly as a poised dagger. It was not small talk. It was a test. Her answer would define everything that came next. He was not the fool the court believed him to be. He was a player, and he had just made his move. The poison was a subtle artist. It did not announce itself with searing pain or sudden sickness. Instead, it worked in whispers, a slow and patient erosion of the self. As the end of the month drew near, Elara felt its touch in the slight, almost imperceptible tremor that sometimes afflicted her hands, a weakness she had to consciously still. It was a coldness that settled deep in her bones, a weariness that sleep could not banish. It was Valerius's voice in her mind, a constant silent reminder, "You are mine." The summons came as it always did, disguised as an act of kindness. A bouquet of black irises arrived at her chambers, their petals as dark and velvety as a midnight sky. Tucked within the funereal blooms was a small, tightly rolled scroll, its message written in the lemon juice ink that only revealed itself when held to a flame. The message was simple. The aviary. Midnight. The royal aviary was a relic of a forgotten age, a skeletal dome of rusted iron and shattered glass on the far eastern edge of the palace grounds. No birds had sung there for a generation. It was a place of decay and silence, a fitting throne room for a man who thrived in the shadows. Elara dressed in a simple dark cloak, her face obscured by its deep hood. She moved through the moon-drenched gardens like a phantom, her path carefully chosen to avoid the patrols of the king's guard. She felt their eyes on her from the castle walls, and knew with a chilling certainty that her movements were being tracked. Whether they were the king's men or Valerius's, she did not know. In this game, every shadow could hide a friend or a foe. He was waiting for her inside the dilapidated structure, a tall, dark figure standing motionless amidst the debris and overgrown ivy. Moonlight streamed through the broken dome, casting a silver pallor on his severe, handsome features. He did not turn as she approached, his gaze fixed on the distant dark line of the mountains. "You have done well," Valerius said, his voice echoing softly in the cavernous space. "The king is besotted. The court speaks of nothing else. You have made him a fool." "I have done as you commanded," Elara replied, her voice carefully neutral. She kept a respectful distance. Proximity to this man felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. He finally turned to face her, his dark eyes appraising her from head to toe. "Indeed, your performance in the garden with the Duchess was a masterstroke of subtlety. You have exceeded my expectations." The praise felt like a spider's caress, and she fought the urge to recoil. He saw her not as a person, but as a finely crafted tool that was functioning to specification. From within his cloak he produced a small leaden vial. The antidote. He held it out to her but did not release it when she reached for it. His fingers closed around hers, his grip surprisingly strong, his skin cold as stone. "Remember your purpose, Elara," he murmured, his voice a low threat. "The king's affection is a means to an end, not a prize to be won. Do not allow yourself the weakness of sentiment." "I have not forgotten my mother," she said, her voice laced with ice. It was the only truth she could offer him. A flicker of something, perhaps satisfaction, crossed his face. He released her hand and the vial. "Good." She uncorked it without hesitation and drank the contents. It tasted of bitter herbs and earth. The relief was almost immediate, a slow warmth that pushed back the creeping cold, stilling the tremor in her hands. The feeling was both a reprieve and a profound humiliation. She hated this dependence, this monthly ritual of submission that kept her alive. "Your success has accelerated my plans," Valerius continued, turning to pace slowly. "The king's public foolishness has made the nobility restless. They whisper of his father, the mad King Aeron, and wonder if the taint in the blood has resurfaced. Now is the time to provide them with proof." "What proof?" Elara asked, her heart beating a little faster. "A legend of the court," Valerius said, a rare hint of excitement in his voice. "The Black Ledger. King Aeron was a meticulous tyrant. He documented everything: his secret pacts, his extortions, the names of nobles he blackmailed, the treasures he plundered. They say the book contains enough filth to bring down every great house in the kingdom. After his death, the ledger vanished. I believe Theron has it." "Why would he keep such a dangerous object?" "Because knowledge is power," Valerius sneered. "He keeps it for the same reason his father did, as a weapon to hold over his enemies. Or perhaps he is a sentimental fool clinging to the last relic of his father's power. It does not matter. You will find it for me." "The king's private chambers are heavily guarded," she protested. "Even I am not permitted in his study without him present." "Then you will use the fool's affection for you to your advantage," Valerius countered smoothly. "Be clever. Be charming. Be the devoted woman who wishes only to share in her king's burdens. He is a man, Elara, and men, even kings, are predictable creatures when a beautiful woman is involved. Find the ledger. With it in my hand, the council will have no choice but to declare him unfit to rule. They will beg me to take the throne to save the kingdom from chaos." His ambition was a palpable thing, a cold fire that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. He saw the throne not as a duty, but as a destiny, and he would sacrifice anyone, her mother, the king, to achieve it. "Do not fail me," he said, his voice dropping once more to a menacing whisper. "The next antidote depends on your progress." He turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving Elara alone in the ruins with the taste of bitter herbs on her tongue and a new, almost impossible task weighing on her soul. Her search began the next day. She spent hours in the royal library poring over architectural plans of the palace, under the guise of studying its history. She paid careful attention in the king's presence, memorizing the layout of his private wing, noting the placement of furniture, the pattern of the guards' patrols, the way the king himself would sometimes cast a fleeting, almost unconscious glance toward a certain section of the wall in his study. She used his infatuation as Valerius had suggested. She would feign a sudden interest in statecraft, asking innocent questions that allowed her to linger in his study while he worked. She ran her fingers along the spines of ancient books, searching for false volumes. She tapped gently on wood-paneled walls, listening for a hollow sound. She examined the heavy tapestries, searching for seams or hinges. The king seemed to enjoy her presence, indulging her curiosity with a patient smile. Yet she always felt his eyes on her, his gaze sharp and assessing even when he seemed most relaxed. It was nearly a fortnight later that she found it. She was in his study, waiting for him to finish a meeting with his treasury minister. A fire crackled in the great stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. While pretending to admire a large tapestry depicting the Battle of the Crimson Field, she noticed something odd. A faint, almost invisible current of air was causing the bottom edge of the tapestry to stir. There were no windows open, no other drafts in the room. Her heart began to pound. After the king had dismissed his minister and retired for the evening, she pleaded a headache and asked to remain in the quiet of the study to read. He agreed easily, his eyes full of sympathy for her frailty. Once she was certain she was alone, she returned to the tapestry. Pulling the heavy fabric aside, she examined the stone wall behind it. Her fingers, made sensitive by her training, traced the mortar lines, feeling for any irregularity. And then she found it, a single stone in the fireplace mantel, carved with a barely visible royal falcon that shifted slightly under her touch. She pressed it. With a low groan of grinding stone, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow opening. A wave of cool, musty air washed over her. It was a hidden passage, just as the old legends claimed. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she lit a small candle from the mantel and slipped inside. The stone door swung silently shut behind her, plunging her into near-total darkness, save for the flickering flame in her hand. The passage was tight, the air thick with the dust of ages. She could hear the muffled sounds of the castle around her. A distant guard's cough, the faint strains of music from the lower halls, as if she were a ghost, walking within the palace's very bones. She followed the passage as it sloped upwards, her instincts telling her it ran parallel to the king's private chambers. As she neared a section of the wall paneled with dark wood, she heard voices. She pressed her ear to a crack in the wood, her candle shielded by her hand. The voices were clear, coming from the other side. One was the king's. The other was a man she did not recognize, his voice deep and gravelly. "Your Majesty, my uncle's agents are growing bolder," the unfamiliar voice said. "The rumors of your indiscretions are spreading as planned. 3 more nobles have pledged him their secret support since the festival." Elara's blood ran cold. "Let them," came the king's reply, and there was a weariness in his voice she had never heard before, but also a core of tempered steel. "A traitor who believes he is winning grows careless." "And what of the girl, Elara Vance?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow. "She is exactly as you predicted, sire," the other man said. Elara recognized him now from court gossip, General Kalen, the king's reclusive and utterly loyal spymaster. Cunning, cautious, Valerius believes her to be his perfect weapon. A long pause followed. Elara held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the candlestick. "She is more than a weapon," Theron said finally, his voice low and complex, a strange mix of calculation and something else, something she could not name. "She is the key. Valerius thinks he is testing her loyalty to him. In truth, we are testing her capacity for something more. Watch her, Kalen, but do not interfere. The choice must be her own." Elara pulled back from the wall as if burned, her mind reeling. She stumbled back down the dark passage, her candle flame trembling, casting wild shadows that seemed to leap and mock her. She found the trigger and slipped back out into the study, the heavy stone door closing silently behind her. She stood there in the firelight, her heart hammering against her ribs, the entire foundation of her world shattered. He knows. He had known all along. His courtship, his favor, his vulnerability. All of it was a performance, a lie, a meticulously crafted trap. She was not the predator stalking her prey. She was the bait deliberately placed in the center of a snare, and 2 master huntsmen were watching from the shadows, waiting to see which way she would run when the jaws snapped shut. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The Festival of the Twin Moons was the crown jewel of the Elysian social calendar, a night when the palace threw open its gates, and the rigid etiquette of the court was permitted to soften into festive revelry. Thousands of paper lanterns, painted with intricate scenes from mythology, bobbed in the gentle night breeze, casting a warm, dreamy glow over the gardens. The air was alive with music, the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the excited chatter of the kingdom's elite, all dressed in their most spectacular finery. Elara stood by King Theron's side in the main pavilion, a vision in a gown of shimmering silver that seemed woven from the very moonlight it reflected. She played her part to perfection, smiling, laughing at the king's jests, and accepting the fawning compliments of the courtiers with practiced humility. But beneath the placid surface, her senses were stretched taut, every nerve alight. The knowledge she had gained in the hidden passage had transformed the world around her. She no longer saw a glittering party. She saw a battlefield. Every smiling nobleman could be one of Valerius's conspirators, every whispering lady-in-waiting one of the king's spies. And she was the solitary figure, standing on the treacherous no-man's land between them. She felt Duchess Seraphina's gaze on her throughout the evening, a stare as hot and sharp as a branding iron. The Duchess was a supernova of beauty tonight, her fiery hair adorned with diamonds, her emerald green gown a defiant challenge to Elara's cool silver. But the easy arrogance she once wore had been replaced by a brittle, desperate edge. Elara knew with the cold certainty of a fellow pawn that Serafina's failure in the Rose Garden would not have been taken lightly by Lord Valerius. He was not a man who tolerated incompetence. Tonight, the Duchess was no longer merely playing for favor. She was fighting for her survival. A cornered serpent, Elara knew, was when its venom was most potent. The catalyst arrived in the form of a foreign dignitary. He was introduced as Ambassador Tarek of the Sunstone Dominion, a desert kingdom to the south with a long and storied history of border disputes with Ethel. He was a striking man with skin the color of burnished bronze, dark, intelligent eyes, and a charisma that was both exotic and disarming. He moved through the Ethelian court with an easy confidence that drew a crowd wherever he went, and he seemed to have eyes only for Elara. He approached her on the pretense of discussing Ethelian art, his compliments as polished as the black obsidian signet ring on his finger. Elara was a fortress of caution. Every word she spoke was measured, every glance calculated. She was polite, engaging, but revealed nothing. She was acutely aware of who was watching this exchange. The king observed them from a distance, his expression unreadable over the rim of his wine goblet. Lord Valerius stood half hidden in the shadows of a marble colonnade, his face a mask of predatory stillness, and Duchess Serafina watched with an almost feverish intensity. This was a performance, and the entire court was the audience. The trap was sprung just as the twin moons, silver and pearl, reached their zenith in the night sky. The king had been drawn away by his council chancellor to discuss some urgent matter of state. It was the opening Serafina had been waiting for. She moved to the center of the pavilion, her voice ringing out sharp and clear, cutting through the music and laughter. "A moment of your attention, my lords and ladies." The festive hum died down, replaced by a curious silence. All eyes turned to the Duchess, who stood proud and accusatory, her finger pointed directly at Elara. "We have a traitor in our midst," she declared, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "I have just witnessed Lady Elara Vance, the king's own favorite, passing a secret message to the ambassador of the Sunstone Dominion." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Treason. It was the blackest of accusations, a charge that was always answered with the executioner's axe. "It's true," a young guard captain cried out, stepping forward from the crowd. He was one of Serafina's known associates. "I saw it myself." A folded piece of parchment passed from her hand to his during their conversation. "This is an outrage," Ambassador Tarek boomed, his expression one of diplomatic fury. "An insult to my person and my kingdom." But Serafina was relentless. "She uses her closeness to the king to steal state secrets for our enemies. I demand that she be arrested and search the ambassador as well, for the security of the throne." The atmosphere had turned venomous. The courtiers who had been flattering Elara moments before now shrank away, their faces pale. Guards, their faces grim under their plumed helmets, began to step forward, their hands on the hilts of their swords. They looked uncertainly toward the king's empty chair, then at the accuser, a high-ranking duchess. Elara's world narrowed to a single terrifying point. This was it. The moment of choice Theron had spoken of in the hidden passage. Was this Valerius's gambit, a direct move to eliminate her and frame the king for trusting a traitor? Or was it something else, a test? She looked at the advancing guards, at Serafina's triumphant face, and made her decision. She would not fight. She would not argue. She would place her life, her fate, in the hands of the man who had called her the key. With an almost preternatural calm, she stood her ground, her hands held loosely at her sides, her expression one of quiet, dignified confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" King Theron's voice was not loud, but it sliced through the tension like Valerius' steel. He had returned, flanked by the formidable General Kalen. His face was a mask of cold fury, but to Elara's surprise and terror, it was directed not at Serafina, but at her. "Your Majesty," Serafina said, dropping into a deep curtsy. "Thank the heavens you have returned. This woman has betrayed you. She is a spy." The king's eyes, hard as green ice, bored into Elara. "Is this true, my lady? Have you been consorting with our enemies?" For a horrifying second, Elara thought she had made a fatal miscalculation. But then she saw the faintest, almost imperceptible signal from General Kalen behind the king, a slight narrowing of the eyes. It was a confirmation. "Play your part." Tears welled in her eyes, real tears born of terror and relief. I do not understand, your Majesty." she whispered, her voice breaking. The ambassador and I were merely discussing poetry. A likely story, Serafina scoffed. Search them. The proof will be on their persons. An excellent suggestion, Duchess. The king said, his voice dangerously smooth. He nodded to the guards. Search the ambassador. The man who called himself Tarek smiled wryly and held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. The guards searched him thoroughly, patting down his elaborate robes. They found nothing. No note. No parchment. The king let the silence hang in the air for a dramatic moment before he spoke again. Perhaps that is because there is no note to be found. He turned his gaze upon the crowd, his voice resonating with newfound power. Or perhaps it is because this man is not in fact an ambassador at all. He gestured to the man, who bowed deeply. My lords and ladies, allow me to present Captain Marcus of my royal guard. The shock that ripped through the pavilion was a physical force. Marcus straightened up, the charming desert diplomat, replaced by a hardened Athelian soldier. Serafina's face went white as bleached bone. For some weeks the king continued, his voice like rolling thunder. I have been aware of a current of discontent, of whispers in the shadows. I chose to conduct a test of loyalty. Captain Marcus has played his part beautifully, reporting to me on all who approached him with treacherous intent. His gaze fell upon Serafina, and there was no mercy in it. General Kalen, the spymaster, stepped forward, holding a leather-bound folio. Your Majesty, we have intercepted correspondence between the Duchess Serafina and the Lord Valerius. He opened the folio and read in a clear, damning voice. The plan is set. The foreign dog will be the excuse. The girl Vance will be accused publicly at the festival. Her treason will reflect on the king's judgment, proving him unfit. Once she is condemned, our path to the throne will be clear. Serafina let out a choked sob. Her meticulously constructed world had just been obliterated. She fell to her knees, her bravado shattering into a million pieces. Your Majesty, forgive me. I was manipulated, Lord Valerius. What? Duchess Theron interrupted, his voice soft but cutting. He forced you to betray your king? No. He merely gave voice to the ambition and jealousy already in your heart. He looked out at the assembled nobles, and none could meet his gaze. He then looked toward the shadows where his uncle stood. For a long, silent moment, the two men locked eyes across the stunned pavilion. It was a silent, brutal declaration of war. When the king finally spoke again, his verdict was swift. Duchess Serafina, for your treason against the crown, you are stripped of all titles and lands. You will be escorted to the Silent Sisterhood convent on the Isle of Thorns, where you will live out your days in prayer and contemplation. Be grateful that I grant you your life. As guards led the weeping, broken woman away, the king walked directly to where Elara stood still, frozen in the center of the room. The court held its collective breath. He stopped before her, and in a gesture that stunned the entire kingdom, took her hand in his. His grip was warm, firm, a lifeline in a storm-tossed sea. He raised her hand and spoke, his voice ringing with absolute authority, a king claiming his territory. Let it be known now and forever that Lady Elara Vance has my complete and unwavering trust. Her counsel is my counsel. Her safety is my safety. Any who would dare to move against her will be considered to have moved against the throne itself. He turned her to face the court, keeping her hand firmly in his. She stood beside him, no longer just a favorite, but a symbol of his power, a shield he had raised against his enemies. She felt the warmth of his hand, a shocking point of contact in her cold, calculated world. And from across the hall, she felt the icy, murderous stare of Lord Valerius. He had lost a battle, but his eyes promised a war. Elara had been saved from the serpent's fangs, only to be placed directly in the lion's den, chained to the lion himself. In the days following the Festival of the Twin Moons, Elara's world transformed. The whispers that had once followed her, laced with envy and speculation, were now hushed with fear and awe. Courtiers who had previously offered her condescending smiles now bowed their heads so low their noses nearly brushed the marble floors. Servants scurried from her path as if she were the queen herself. The king's public declaration had not just been a shield. It had been a coronation of sorts, elevating her from the ambiguous position of royal favorite to an untouchable, undefined center of power. She had never felt more like a prisoner. The king's protection was a cage far more intricate than Valerius's poison. Every meal was tasted, every gift inspected, and 2 of the king's most elite personal guards were now stationed permanently outside her chambers. She was safe, but she was also under constant surveillance. She was the king's most prized possession, and he was taking no chances. She waited for a summons from Valerius, a furious demand for an explanation, but none came. The silence from her master was more unnerving than any threat. He was waiting, reassessing his strategy now that his most valuable piece had been so publicly claimed by his opponent. The game had changed, and Elara was caught in the terrifying stillness before the next more violent move. The summons, when it came, was from the king. It was not a perfumed invitation delivered by a page, but a quiet word from General Kalin, who appeared at her door himself as dusk settled over the capital. His face, a roadmap of old scars and quiet loyalties, was as unreadable as ever. "His Majesty requests your presence in the solarium, my lady," he said, his voice a low gravel. "He wishes to speak with you privately." The solarium was not a place of public audience. It was a small glass-walled room at the very top of the citadel's spire, a private sanctuary built by Theron's grandfather, a known astronomer and philosopher. It was said that the king came here when he needed to think a place high above the politics and whispers of the court below. To be invited there was a sign of ultimate trust, or the setting for a final inescapable trap. She followed Kalin through winding stone corridors and up a narrow spiral staircase, the air growing cooler and thinner with each step. He left her at a heavy oak door, bowing his head before retreating back down the stairs, his footsteps echoing into silence. Taking a deep breath, Elara pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was circular, its walls made almost entirely of glass, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the capital city, glittering like a field of scattered jewels below. A massive brass telescope stood in the center of the room, aimed at the heavens. Books on astronomy and philosophy were stacked on every available surface. And standing by the curved glass, looking out at the vast darkness, was King Theron. He was not dressed in his royal finery. He wore a simple dark tunic, his golden hair unadorned. When he turned to face her, the mask of the charming, languid monarch was gone. In its place was the face of a man bearing a weight she could only begin to imagine. His eyes were weary, his shoulders tense. This was not the king. This was Theron. "Thank you for coming, Elara," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual performative flourish. "Your Majesty," she began, sinking into a curtsy. "No," he said, raising a hand. "Not here. Here there are no titles. There is only the sky, the city, and the truth. And the truth is what we must speak tonight." He gestured to a pair of simple wooden chairs near the telescope. She sat her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, a fortress of composure. He remained standing, his silhouette framed against the starry sky. "My uncle has been very quiet since the festival," he began, his voice casual, yet every word was a deliberate probe. "I imagine his letters to you have become more urgent." The directness of the statement stole the air from her lungs. There was no accusation, no anger, just a simple statement of fact that laid everything bare between them. He knew. He had always known. "He believes I am a fool." Theron continued, a bitter, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "He is not alone in that. Most of the court agrees with him. They see a young king obsessed with wine women and trivialities. They see the weak son of a mad father, a pale imitation of the Targaryen dynasty." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It is a role I have played very carefully for a very long time. An underestimated opponent is a predictable one. And my uncle is nothing if not predictable." He finally moved from the window, pulling the other chair to sit directly across from her, their knees almost touching. The small space felt charged, intimate, and incredibly dangerous. "I knew who you were before you ever set foot in my court." "Elara," he said, his green eyes locking onto hers, leaving her no place to hide. "I knew your father was in my uncle's pocket. When I learned he had a daughter of surpassing beauty and intelligence, a daughter hidden from the world, I knew what Valerius's next move would be. He has always favored using beautiful things to do his dirty work." Shame, hot and sharp, pricked at her, but she held his gaze, refusing to look away. "What I did not know," Theron admitted, his voice softening, "was the price you were forced to pay. I did not know about your mother, or the poison." The final word landed like a death knell. Elara's composure, so carefully maintained, finally fractured. An involuntary gasp escaped her lips. He knew everything. The full, horrific scope of her enslavement. "My spies are very good," he said, answering her unspoken question. "They discovered the nature of Valerius's assurance, An exquisite blend, I believe he called it. His voice was laced with a cold fury that seemed directed not at her but at his uncle. A chain he thought would bind you to him forever. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Which brings us to now, Elara, and to a choice, the one I spoke of to Kaelin. Your choice. He laid out her options with the cold precision of a general planning a campaign. You can continue to serve him. You can pretend this conversation never happened. You can try to find the black ledger he so desperately wants, a book that I assure you does not exist. He will praise you. He will use you. And when you are no longer useful, or when my armies finally crush his rebellion, he will leave you to die. The antidote he gives you is not a lifeline. It is merely a longer execution. The brutal honesty of it chilled her to the core. Or, he said, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more persuasive. You can help me, not as my pawn, not as a spy, but as my ally. He reached across the small space and for the first time took her hand. His touch was not possessive but a gesture of shocking equality. As my equal. Together we can destroy him. We can dismantle the web of treason he has spent years weaving. We can bring men like your father to justice. He squeezed her hand gently. And you can have the one thing I know you truly desire. Justice for your mother. Justice for... Her mother's dying words screamed in her mind. Trust. No. Man. And this man, this king, was the most dangerous of them all. He was a master manipulator, a strategist who had been playing a game of feigned weakness while she had been struggling just to survive. Was this just a more sophisticated trap? An offer of a different kind of servitude gilded with words like ally and equal? But then she looked into his eyes. And behind the calculating strategist, she saw something else. She saw a profound loneliness, the crushing isolation of a man born to a crown he had to fight to keep surrounded by enemies with no one he could trust. He was as much a prisoner of his station as she was of her poison, and he was offering her a path to freedom, a path to vengeance, a path to life. Valerius offered only continued servitude, ending in a slow, agonizing death. The choice, when viewed with such brutal clarity, was no choice at all. It was a matter of survival. She slowly pulled her hand from his, the contact having become too intimate, too confusing. She stood and walked to the glass wall, looking down at the city lights, her reflection a pale ghost against the darkness. If I help you, she said, her voice steady, it is not for you. It is for my mother. It is for myself. I would expect nothing less, he replied from behind her. My life is still on his clock, she stated, turning to face him. I need the real antidote. Not a promise, not a future possibility. The cure. General Kaelin's agents have been working on it for months, Theron said without hesitation. They have identified most of the components from a sample we acquired. They believe they are close to synthesizing a permanent cure. Align with me and their work becomes solely dedicated to that purpose. It was the final piece. The hope, however faint, of a true escape. She looked at him, the king, her target, her potential savior, her enemy's enemy. A fragile, dangerous alliance. I will help you, your majesty. She said, her voice formal once more, a shield to protect the turbulent emotions within. For now. A faint, weary smile touched his lips. He understood her caution, her refusal to grant him her trust. He accepted it. For now, he agreed, is all I ask. They stood in the silent, star-dusted room, two solitary figures who had just forged a pact in the heart of a storm. A king playing the fool and a spy playing the lover, now bound together by mutual enemies and shared desperation. As Elara descended the winding stairs back to her gilded cage, she felt the familiar cold thrum of the poison in her veins. She had a new ally, a powerful one. But the clock was still ticking louder than ever before, and she knew this fragile alliance, born of shadows and secrets, could shatter at the slightest misstep, leaving her to face her fate alone. Their fragile alliance was forged in the cold, clear light of the solarium high above the sleeping city. It was a partnership born not of trust, but of the grim calculus of survival. With General Kaelin as a silent, watchful third, they mapped out their campaign of deception, moving carved ivory figures across a large star chart as if they were planning a war. And in truth they were. My uncle is a creature of arrogance. Theron explained, his finger tracing the path of a silver comet. He cannot conceive of a mind more cunning than his own. We will not fight his conspiracy, we will feed it. We will give it the shape and form we desire. He believes you are weak, paranoid, and easily led by emotion. Elara added her voice a low counterpoint. She moved a piece representing herself closer to the king's. I will tell him he is right. I will whisper that you are haunted by your father's ghost, that you rant in your sleep, that you have become obsessed with finding the Black Ledger, because you fear the secrets it holds about your own legitimacy. Theron looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his green eyes. You have a talent for this, my lady. You know precisely which lies will confirm his own biases. I have had a good teacher in the art of manipulation, she replied, and the bitter edge in her voice was lost on neither of them. And so the grand performance began. Elara became the most devoted of confidants, her concern for the king's deteriorating mental state a masterpiece of public theater. She would be seen pleading with him in the gardens, her expression a mask of gentle worry. She would confide in ladies-in-waiting she knew were in Valerius's pay, weeping softly about the king's dark moods and strange obsessions. Her secret meetings with Valerius's agents were terrifying walks on a razor's edge. One evening she met a contact in the echoing nave of the great cathedral during Vespers. As the choir's voices soared to the heavens, she passed him a slip of parchment. It was a list of names purportedly copied from a page in Theron's Journal of Nobles the king suspected of treason. The list was a careful fabrication by General Kalen, a mix of Valerius's known supporters and a few powerful unaligned lords whose loyalty Theron and Kalen wished to test. He grows more paranoid by the day, she whispered to the agent, her face hidden in the shadows of a pillar. He trusts no one, not even me entirely. He speaks of the ledger constantly, that it is the key to purging the court of his father's enemies. She could see the glint of triumph in the agent's eyes as he palmed the note. The information was exactly what his master wanted to hear. While Elara sowed seeds of discord, Theron played his own part with a terrifying conviction. He descended into a parody of his father's madness. He hosted a 3-day feast, not for a visiting dignitary, but in honor of his favorite hunting falcon, forcing the kingdom's highest nobles to toast the bird's health. He commissioned a life-sized statue of himself to be carved from a single block of priceless white marble, only to declare it flawed upon completion and order it smashed to pieces in the palace courtyard. The court, already unsettled, began to panic. Theron's behavior was no longer seen as youthful folly, but as the undeniable blossoming of the Targaryen madness. He would fall asleep in council meetings, his chin resting on his chest, only to awaken with a start and make some bizarre, nonsensical decree. He spent a fortune on a troupe of foreign dancers, while petitions from the northern provinces begging for funds to reinforce the garrisons against barbarian raids went unanswered. The alienation was swift and brutal. Respected, long-serving ministers resigned their posts in disgust. Old, powerful families who had served the crown for generations began to hold quiet, anxious meetings in their city estates. And at the center of this growing web of discontent was Lord Valerius, playing the part of the stoic, loyal servant of the crown, his face a mask of sorrowful concern for his nephew's tragic decline. He was the anchor of stability in a storm of the king's own making. The danger for Elara was constant and acute. She was the fulcrum of the entire deception, and she felt the pressure from both sides. One afternoon she was in the library receiving a coded update from General Kalen tucked inside a book on military history, when one of her own ladies-in-waiting entered the alcove without warning. The young woman, Lady Anya, had been assigned to her by the Queen Mother, but Elara knew from Kalen that she reported everything she saw and heard directly to Lord Valerius. Elara's heart seized. The coded message was a tiny scroll of parchment visible in the spine of the open book. Thinking instantly, Elara let the heavy tome slip from her fingers, letting it fall to the floor with a loud thud. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she cried, her voice full of frustration. As Anya rushed to help her, Elara knelt, and in the motion of gathering the book, she palmed the small scroll, tucking it into the sleeve of her gown. "My lady, are you all right?" Anya asked, her eyes full of feigned concern. "Just weary," Elara sighed, pressing a hand to her temple. "The king's moods have been so volatile. It drains the spirit." She had given the spy exactly the kind of gossip she had come for, turning a moment of extreme peril into another layer of their shared deception. But the cold sweat that trickled down her back was a chilling reminder of how close she was to a fatal mistake. The culmination of Theron's performance came during the midwinter session of the Royal Council. The chamber was cold, the mood even colder. The nobles and ministers sat around the great oak table, their faces grim. The issue at hand was the northern garrisons. A respected general, Duke Alaric, a man whose loyalty to the crown was beyond question, was giving a stark report of crumbling fortifications and under-equipped soldiers. "Your Majesty," the Duke pleaded, his voice heavy with urgency. "If we do not send supplies and reinforcements before the spring thaw, the northern pass will be vulnerable. The barbarian hordes will pour through." Theron, who had been idly polishing a large emerald on his finger, looked up with an expression of profound boredom. "Barbarians, barbarians?" he sighed. Such a tedious topic, all that mud and snow. He tossed the emerald into the air and caught it. "I have a far more pressing matter. The royal menagerie. I have been promised a white lion from the southern deserts, a creature of sublime beauty. It requires a new enclosure, one with heated floors and a constant supply of fresh gazelle meat. The cost is considerable." A stunned silence fell over the chamber. Duke Alaric stared at the king as if he had lost his mind. "A lion, Your Majesty," the Duke stammered, "while your soldiers freeze in their watchtowers." It was then that Lord Valerius intervened, his voice a soothing balm of reason. "Your Majesty, perhaps the Duke has a point. Matters of state security, however tedious, must take precedence. The lion can surely wait." He sounded like the soul of responsible governance, the concerned uncle gently guiding his wayward nephew. It was the cue Theron had been waiting for. He surged to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the floor. His face was a mask of furious, childish rage. "Precedence!" he roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I am the king. My will takes precedence. You dare to question me." He pointed a trembling finger at Duke Alaric. "You, who have grown old and fearful in your service. Your loyalty is to budgets and builders, not to your king's vision. You have forgotten your place." "Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect." The Duke began, his face pale with shock. "Silence," Theron screamed. "I find your counsel tiresome, and your face even more so. You are dismissed from this council. Go north and count your crumbling stones yourself." He then swept his gaze over the other horrified faces. "All of you. You are leeches clinging to the past. I would rather seek the counsel of my tailor. At least he understands beauty." Without another word, he stormed from the chamber, his royal cape swirling behind him, leaving a tableau of absolute shock and horror in his wake. Elara remained seated, playing her part. She looked toward her uncle, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and despair, the perfect image of the king's devoted, helpless victim. The spell of the king's authority was broken. In the stunned silence, Duke Alaric slowly gathered his papers, his face ashen, the public humiliation having shattered a lifetime of loyal service. As he turned to leave, Lord Valerius rose and placed a calm, steadying hand on his shoulder. He leaned in, his voice too low for Elara to hear, but his expression was one of profound sympathy and grim resolve. He then moved to the next nobleman, and the next, a quiet word here, a commiserating nod there. He was not a conspirator anymore. He was a savior, gathering the broken pieces of a kingdom shattered by a mad king. Elara watched it all, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. She could feel the conspiracy accelerating, hurtling towards a violent, bloody conclusion. When she returned to her chambers that night, her entire body trembling with the strain of the day's performance, she found it waiting for her. Placed carefully on the silk of her pillow was a single, perfect black iris. Tucked into its dark heart was a tiny scroll. She unrolled it with shaking fingers. It contained only one word: tonight. The midnight meeting took place deep in the belly of the palace, in the cold, silent crypts, where the Targaryen kings of old lay entombed in granite sarcophagi. The air was frigid and smelled of damp stone and the dust of centuries. Valerius had chosen the location for its theatricality and its finality. This was a place of endings, and he had summoned her here to orchestrate one. He stood beside the tomb of Theron's father, the Mad King Aeron, a shadowy figure whose presence seemed to desecrate the hallowed ground. He was no longer playing the part of the concerned uncle. The mask was off, revealing the cold reptilian ambition that had always lurked beneath. Victory was within his grasp, and his eyes burned with a dark fire. "The council is broken," he said, his voice a low hiss that seemed to disturb the ancient dust. "The army is divided. The people are restless. The fruit is ripe for the picking, Elara. Tonight we shall pluck it from the vine." He produced a tiny vial from his cloak. It was different from the leaden antidote containers. This one was crafted from black volcanic glass, and the liquid inside seemed to suck the torchlight from the air. "The tears of Nyxia," he said, holding it up. "Tasteless, odorless, and utterly lethal. A single drop in his wine and his heart will simply stop. The royal physician will declare it a seizure, a tragic manifestation of the family's tainted bloodline. There will be no questions." Elara stared at the vial, her blood turning to ice. This was it. The precipice. "He trusts you," Valerius continued, his voice a seductive poison of its own. "He will drink from your hand without a second thought. Do this, and you will have everything you have ever dreamed of." He stepped closer, his cold fingers closing around her arm. "The true and permanent antidote. Your father will be named my chancellor, and you, my dear Elara, will be my queen." He was offering her the world, a world built on the corpse of the king. "And if I refuse," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. His smile was a terrifying thing. "Then the poison already in your veins will seem a swift and gentle mercy compared to what I will do to you before you die. Do not mistake my generosity for weakness. You are my creature, Elara, my weapon. And tonight you will strike." He pressed the black vial into her hand. Its coldness seemed to burn her skin. "He has invited you for a private supper. Do not fail." He released her and was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the crypt, leaving her alone with the ghosts of dead kings and the instrument of a living one's murder. She had to warn Theron, but every move she made was watched. Returning to her chambers, she knew Lady Anya's eyes would be on her, cataloging her every mood, her every gesture. A direct meeting was impossible. She went to her bookshelf, her mind racing, and pulled out a heavy volume bound in green leather, The Scholar's Gambit, a dense treatise on political strategy they had once discussed. It was the signal. The final act is in motion. She summoned a young page boy she knew from Kaelin's reports to be fiercely loyal to the king. "His Majesty left this in my reading room," she said, her voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "He asked me to return it to his study when I was finished. Would you be so kind?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide with sympathy for the king's troubled favorite, and took the book. 2 hours later, a reply came. A single gardenia, the king's favorite flower, was delivered to her room. Tucked beneath a petal was a tiny, almost invisible note. "The western balcony. 10 minutes." She found him there, shrouded in the darkness, looking out over the city. The wind whipped his golden hair around his face. "Valerius has made his move," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She showed him the black vial. Theron took it, his expression grim. "I expected as much. He is not a patient man. From his own tunic he produced an identical vial, and I am not a foolish one. The royal physician is a man of unshakable loyalty," Theron explained quickly, his voice low and urgent. "This is not poison. It is a compound of his own devising. A powerful paralytic derived from the venom of the glass-spined serpent, mixed with a sleeping draught from the poppy fields of the south. It will stop the heart to a near imperceptible flutter and induce a state that perfectly mimics death. But it is dangerous, Elara. The dosage is precise. Too little, and I will awaken in my own tomb. Too much." He did not need to finish. Not. He looked at her, his green eyes serious in the moonlight. "Once you do this, there is no turning back. His men will seize you. You will be his prisoner. You will have to be convincing in your grief, or he will suspect and kill you on the spot. Can you do it?" She thought of her mother's face, pale in the lamplight, her last desperate whisper. She thought of Valerius's cold smile and her father's dead eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice hard as diamond. "Good," he said. He took her hands, his grip surprisingly warm in the cold night. For a moment, all strategy, all deception fell away, and they were just two people standing on the brink of an abyss. Whatever happens, Elara, survive. The private dining room was an intimate, oppressive space. A fire roared in the hearth, but it did little to chase away the chill of dread that hung in the air. The food, a lavish spread of roasted quail and spiced pears, sat largely untouched between them. Theron played his part with agonizing perfection. He was melancholy, his words slurred as if he had already been drinking heavily. He lamented the disloyalty of his court, the burdens of his crown, the ghost of his father. He was the very picture of a broken man, a king ready to surrender. Elara's performance was equally flawless. She was the loving, comforting consort, her voice a soft murmur of reassurance, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes full of a deep, sorrowful affection. Their dialogue was a tightrope walk of double meanings. Sometimes I think it would be for the best. Theron sighed, swirling the deep red wine in his goblet. An end to all this strife. To simply rest. He looked at her, his eyes full of a manufactured despair. "Would you miss me, Elara?" "More than the sun itself, my love," she replied, her heart aching with the truth hidden in the lie. The moment came. The servant had left the decanter of wine on the sideboard. Elara rose, her movements fluid, a picture of grace. "Let me, my king," she said softly. "You have had too much." Her back was to him. With hands that she prayed were steady, she uncorked the vial Valerius had given her, the black tears of Nyxia, and poured its contents into the embers of the fire. It vanished with a silent, colorless hiss. Then she took out the identical vial Theron had provided and uncorked it. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she poured the clear, syrupy liquid into the silver decanter, swirling it to mix with the wine. She returned to the table and filled his goblet. The dark liquid seemed to pulse in the candlelight. She handed it to him. Their eyes met over the rim, and in that shared gaze was a universe of fear, of desperate hope, of a terrifying, unbreakable trust. He gave her the barest of nods. He drank it all in one long, slow draught, then set the goblet down with a soft click. For a moment, nothing happened. He smiled at her, a faint, sad smile. "Thank you, my—" His words cut off in a sharp, ragged gasp. His eyes went wide with shock. He clutched at his chest, his fingers digging into the fine silk of his tunic. A terrible guttural sound escaped his lips, and he pitched forward, overturning the small table. The silver decanter, goblets, and plates crashed to the floor in a cacophony of shattering crystal and ringing metal. He lay amidst the wreckage, his body convulsing once, twice, and then falling terrifyingly still. Elara's scream was not a performance. It was a raw, primal sound torn from the very depths of her soul. She scrambled to his side, her hands fluttering over his chest, searching for a breath, a heartbeat, anything. There was nothing. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. His skin was already growing cool. "Your Majesty!" she shrieked, her voice breaking with a hysteria that was only half feigned. "Guards, help the king!" The doors burst open. But it was not the crimson-cloaked royal guard who entered. It was a squad of soldiers wearing the silver and black of Lord Valerius's personal legion. They moved with a chilling efficiency, their faces grim and set. Their captain, a man known for his brutal loyalty to Valerius, took in the scene with a cold, practiced eye. "The king is dead," he announced, his voice devoid of emotion. He gestured to his men. "Secure Lady Elara. She is a material witness." Two soldiers seized her arms, their grips like iron bands, and pulled her away from Theron's body. She fought, weeping, screaming his name, playing the part of the distraught lover to the bitter end. And then Lord Valerius himself swept into the room. He was dressed in black mourning clothes, his face a perfect mask of shock and sorrow. He rushed to his nephew's side, kneeling, a picture of feigned grief. "No," he whispered, his voice catching. "It cannot be." He looked up, his eyes finding Elara's, and beneath the performance, she saw the cold reptilian gleam of absolute triumph. He rose and took command. "Seal the palace. No one enters or leaves. Find the royal physician." His orders were sharp, clear, the voice of a man born to rule. As Elara was dragged from the room, a prisoner in all but name, she cast one last desperate look over her shoulder. The royal physician, Master Valerius, was just entering, his face a mask of horror. But right behind him was another man, Valerius's personal doctor, a sinister figure known for his skill with poisons. A sliver of ice-cold doubt pierced through her feigned hysteria. The plan had been perfect. But what if it had been too perfect? What if Valerius, in his cunning, had anticipated such a deception? What if the wine had been poisoned before she ever touched the decanter? She saw Theron's still form on the floor, his eyes vacant, and a terrifying thought took root in her mind. What if the plan had gone horribly wrong? What if she had just killed the only man who could ever have saved her? The heavy oak door of her chambers slammed shut, and the sound of the key turning in the lock echoed the final terrifying closing of a tomb. The palace became a theater of mourning overnight. Heavy black drapes were hung over the vibrant tapestries, smothering the castle in a somber, suffocating silence. The music and laughter of the festival were replaced by the funereal shuffling of courtiers' feet and the hollow echo of whispered conversations. Fear was a palpable entity, a cold fog that clung to the marble corridors. Lord Valerius's personal soldiers, clad in the stark silver and black of his house, were now the ubiquitous palace guard. Their presence was a constant grim reminder of the new order. The Targaryen crimson had been supplanted. Lord Valerius, in a masterful performance of statesmanship, addressed the shaken court in the throne room. Dressed in the deepest black, his face etched with a sorrow so profound it appeared genuine, he stood before the empty throne and eulogized his beloved tragic nephew. He spoke of a brilliant mind tragically shadowed by the family's madness, of a good heart led astray by youthful folly. He promised to be the steady hand the kingdom now desperately needed to restore the stability that had been so carelessly squandered. And then he delivered his masterstroke. Our late king's final joy was the love he bore for Lady Elara Vance, he announced, his voice resonating with solemn duty. He cherished her above all others. It is now my sacred responsibility, as Lord Regent of this kingdom, to honor his final wish. I will protect the woman he loved. I will take her as my wife, and together we shall guide this kingdom out of the darkness of our shared grief. The court was stunned into silence. It was a brilliant political move. By marrying Elara, Valerius was not just seizing the throne. He was attempting to inherit the affection and legitimacy Theron had bestowed upon her. He was wrapping his coup in a cloak of romantic duty. Elara heard the news from Lady Anya, whose usual fawning demeanor had been replaced by the smug condescension of a jailer. Elara was now a prisoner in her own lavish chambers. The guards outside her door were not there for her protection. They were there for her containment. She played the part Valerius had cast for her. She became a wraith, a woman shattered by grief. She refused food, turning away trays of the finest delicacies. She would sit by the window for hours, staring blankly at the gardens, her eyes vacant. When spoken to, she would answer in monosyllables, her voice a fragile whisper. She was a beautiful broken thing, too lost in sorrow to be a threat. Her performance was so convincing that after the first week her watchers grew complacent. Lady Anya's constant surveillance softened into infrequent checks, satisfied that her charge was little more than a ghost, haunting her own gilded cage. Her father's arrival was like a blast of cold, harsh wind. Senator Alistair Vance, summoned from his estate, strode into her chambers with the arrogant swagger of a man who has won the ultimate prize. He was to be named Lord Chancellor, the regent's right hand, the second most powerful man in the kingdom. He dismissed Anya with a wave of his hand and surveyed the room, his eyes taking in the opulent furnishings with a proprietary air. He then looked at his daughter, still and silent by the window, and a cruel, satisfied smile touched his lips. "You have done it, girl," he said, his voice a low, triumphant rumble. "All of this. You secured it for us." He gestured around the room. "Your mother, she was a sentimental fool. She never understood that sacrifice is the engine of ambition. But you understand. She would be so proud." The supreme, breathtaking irony of his words was a shard of ice in Elara's heart. She did not look at him. She continued to stare out the window, her silence a wall he could not breach. He mistook her stillness for broken submission. "Come now, no need for this prolonged grief." It was a necessary act. Theron was weak, a pale imitation of his father. Valerius is the leader this kingdom needs. And he placed a heavy hand on her shoulder. "We shall be the power behind the throne. This is our dynasty now." Elara flinched under his touch but remained silent. Her hatred for him was a pure, cold, physical thing. It was no longer a hot fire of rage, but a glacier immense and slow and powerful enough to grind mountains to dust. She would see him in hell. She would send him there herself. Satisfied that she was a properly subdued pawn, he left, leaving her alone with the suffocating weight of his presence. It was 2 weeks later, in the dead of night, that her world shifted on its axis once more. She was awakened by a familiar, yet strangely absent sensation. The subtle, creeping cold of the poison, the precursor to the monthly agony she had come to expect, was not there. At first she thought she was imagining it, but as the days passed, the truth became undeniable. The weakness, the tremors, the deep, aching chill, the telltale signs of the poison's advance failed to appear. Her heart hammered against her ribs. There was only one other explanation. With trembling hands, she pressed her palms against her lower abdomen. It was still flat, unchanged to the eye, but she knew. A life was growing within her, a secret impossible life. Theron's child, the heir to the Elysian throne. The realization was a tidal wave of conflicting emotions. There was a surge of raw, primal terror for the safety of this child conceived in deception and now gestating in a viper's nest. But beneath the fear was a powerful, exhilarating joy, a fierce protective instinct that burned away the last vestiges of her despair. This was no longer just about her survival. It was no longer just about revenge for her mother. She now carried the future. She carried a dynasty. The knowledge was a catalyst, transforming her from a passive survivor into an active player. She could not wait for Theron's loyalists to act. She had to reach them. She had to fight. Her mind, sharpened by months of intrigue, began to work. She thought of the hidden passages. Late that night, when the castle was deep in slumber and Lady Anya was snoring softly in the antechamber, Elara slipped from her bed. She moved to the heavy tapestry of the crimson field, her hands finding the trigger stone in the fireplace mantel. The stone door swung open with a near-silent groan. She slipped into the darkness, a single stolen candle, her only guide. The passages were her secret kingdom now. She used them to move unseen through the palace, gathering information, listening to the conversations of Valerius's men, learning the new routines of the guards. She needed to send a message to General Kalen, but it had to be untraceable. Her eyes fell upon Liam, the young page boy who had delivered the book for her. He was still in the palace, a low-ranking servant now overlooked in the grand shift of power. His loyalty to Theron had been absolute. She decided to risk it. She summoned him to her chambers the next day, on the pretext of needing a book fetched from the library. As he was leaving with Lady Anya, momentarily distracted by another servant, Elara pressed a small, heavy object into his hand. It was her mother's silver locket. "For your sister," she whispered, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "I hear it is her name day. A small gift." The boy's eyes widened slightly as his fingers closed around the cold metal. He understood this was more than a simple gift. He nodded, his expression resolute, and concealed it in his tunic. He would not know that she had spent 2 hours the previous night using the tip of a sewing needle to scratch a coded message onto the soft silver inside the locket, a message only Kalen would understand. It was a line from an old poem they had heard Theron recite. "The lion sleeps, but the forest remembers. A new sun will rise from the ashes." As Elara watched the young page boy walk across the vast courtyard from her window, a tiny, determined figure in a world of giants, she felt the first true flicker of hope. He disappeared through the main gate, carrying her message, carrying their future. She turned from the window and faced her reflection in the dark, polished glass of the armoire. The pale, grieving ghost she had been performing for weeks was gone. Staring back at her was a woman she barely recognized, her eyes hard and clear, her mouth set in a line of unyielding resolve. She instinctively rested a hand over her abdomen, a silent vow to the secret life she now protected. She was not Valerius's weapon. She was not Theron's ally. She was the mother of the true king. She was a queen in mourning, a queen in hiding. She was the keeper of the flame. And from the ashes of her old life, she would forge an empire, or she would burn the world down trying. The morning of the coronation dawned gray and oppressive, the sky the color of unpolished steel. Elara sat motionless as her ladies-in-waiting, supervised by the ever-watchful Lady Anya, dressed her for her wedding. The gown was a masterpiece of political theater, crafted from heavy ivory silk, a color that signified both bridal submission and the official mourning for a dead king. Diamonds and pearls were woven into her hair, cold and heavy against her scalp, mirroring the weight of the crown that awaited her. Her face, reflected in the silver mirror, was a perfect, tragic mask of numb resignation. But beneath the placid surface, her heart beat with the steady, lethal rhythm of a war drum. She was a coiled spring waiting for the signal that would unleash a storm. The procession to the throne room was a funeral march for a life she had never wanted. She walked on the arm of her father, now the newly minted Lord Chancellor. He was radiant with triumph, his chest puffed out with pride, accepting the bows of the courtiers as his due. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, his breath foul with spiced wine. "Smile, daughter. Your destiny has arrived. You are the mother of a new dynasty." Elara's answering smile was a slash of crimson lipstick on a pale face, a promise of the blood that was yet to be spilled. Lord Valerius was waiting for her on the dais before the throne. He was dressed in royal black and gold, looking every inch the king he was about to become. He took her hand from her father's, his grip possessive, his eyes alight with a conqueror's fire. The high priest, a man whose loyalty Valerius had long ago purchased, began the solemn rites, his voice droning on about divine right and the dawn of a new era of stability. Elara stood beside Valerius, her gaze fixed on the great doors at the far end of the hall. She clutched her bridal bouquet of white lilies and dark ivy, the stems wrapped in thick silk. Hidden within the foliage, the cold, slender hilt of a stiletto dagger pressed against her palm. Any moment now, she thought, her entire being focused on the coming cataclysm. The priest raised the heavy ancient crown of Ethel, its gold and jewels glittering in the torchlight. And now he intoned, turning toward Valerius, "By the grace of the gods and the will of the people I crown thee." He never finished the sentence. From the distant courtyard came the sound, a single piercing horn blast that shattered the sanctimonious silence. Then another and another, a chorus of brass calling a kingdom to arms. A wave of confusion rippled through the assembled court. Shouts erupted from outside, followed by the unmistakable, brutal clang of steel on steel. The great oaken doors at the end of the throne room shuddered, then buckled, then exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted iron. Framed in the ruin of the doorway, against the chaotic backdrop of a courtyard in flames, stood a figure clad in night-black Targaryen battle armor, the royal crest of the three-headed dragon emblazoned in crimson on his chest. He raised the visor of his helmet, and a collective gasp of terror and disbelief ripped through the hall. It was King Theron, alive. Behind him stood General Kaelin and a phalanx of the elite royal guard, their swords drawn and already bloodied. Theron's voice, amplified by the hall's acoustics, boomed with the righteous fury of a resurrected god. "I believe," he said, his gaze locking onto the stunned face of his uncle, "you are sitting on my throne." For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then chaos erupted. Kaelin's soldiers charged into the hall, a disciplined wave of crimson and steel, crashing into Valerius's unprepared silver and black legion. The throne room became a maelstrom of violence. Lords and ladies screamed, scrambling for cover as the air filled with the shriek of swords and the guttural cries of dying men. Alliances so carefully forged in whispers and promises shattered in an instant, as nobles, realizing they had backed a losing usurper, either froze in terror or desperately tried to switch sides. In the heart of the storm, Elara moved with a singular, deadly purpose. She tore the dagger from her bouquet and slipped away from the dais, a wraith in ivory silk moving through the chaos. Her target was not Valerius. Not yet. Her first debt was a personal one. She found her father near a side passage, trying to sneak away from the carnage, his face pale with sweat, his triumphant arrogance replaced by the craven fear of a cornered rat. She blocked his path, the stiletto held low and steady in her hand. He stared at her, then at the dagger, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Elara, what is the meaning of this? Help me. We have to escape." "There is no we," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as the blade she held. "There is only you and the ghost you created." "What nonsense are you talking?" he blustered, trying to push past her. She was faster. She sidestepped and pressed the tip of the dagger against the fine wool of his chancellor's robes, right over his heart. He froze. "You killed her," she said, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "You held the dagger. You murdered my mother. I want to hear you say it." I did what was necessary." He stammered, his eyes darting around for help that would not come. "For power. For our family." "You have no family," she said. "You sacrificed them on the altar of your ambition. Say her name. Say that you killed Lyanna Vance." Tears of fear and rage streamed down his face. He saw no mercy in his daughter's eyes, only the finality of the grave. "Yes," he shrieked. "I killed her, the sentimental fool. She would have ruined everything." It was all she needed to hear. The confession was not for the world, but for the wounded child still screaming inside her. "Thank you," she whispered. The motion was quick, brutal, and deeply personal. Not an act of rage, but the cold, clean stroke of justice delivered. She drove the stiletto home, twisting it as her mother had taught her a woman must do. He let out a choked gasp, his eyes wide with a final, uncomprehending shock, and collapsed at her feet. She did not look down. Her debt was paid. She turned back to the main hall. The battle was nearly over. Kaelin's men were ruthlessly efficient. The last of Valerius's legion was being cut down or forced into surrender. And near the throne, Valerius himself was cornered, his sword in hand, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury facing Theron. Seeing Elara emerge from the shadows, her white gown now spattered with her father's blood, Valerius made his final desperate move. He lunged not at Theron, but at her. He seized her, pulling her back against him, the cold steel of his sword pressing against her throat. "Stand down!" he roared, his voice raw with desperation. "All of you, or the queen dies before she is ever crowned." Theron froze, his face contorting in a mask of fury and raw fear for her safety. His soldiers hesitated. Elara did not struggle. She stood perfectly still in Valerius's grasp, her head tilted slightly. "You taught me that sentiment is a weakness, my lord," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "Were you not paying attention to your own lesson?" He faltered for a split second, confused by her lack of fear. It was the only opening she needed. Her mother had not come from noble blood, but from a line of proud nomadic warriors from the eastern steppes, and she had taught her daughter one secret before the court had softened her, a secret of survival. Elara's hand, seemingly relaxed at her side, shot up the heel of her palm, striking Valerius with pinpoint precision at the nerve cluster just below his jaw. At the same time, she stomped the sharp heel of her bridle slipper down onto his instep with all her weight. He cried out a choked gasp of pain, his entire body convulsing from the shock to his nervous system. His sword arm went limp, his grip on her loosened. In that one critical moment of weakness, she drove her elbow back into his ribs with vicious force and tore herself free. Before Valerius could recover, Kaelin's men surged forward, tackling him to the ground and disarming him. The fight was over. The great hall was a scene of carnage and victory, the dead and dying littering the floor beneath the impassive gaze of the Targaryen dragon tapestries. Theron rushed to her side, his eyes scanning her desperately for any sign of injury. She stood steady, her chest heaving, the bloody stiletto still clutched in her hand. Her wedding gown, a symbol of submission, was now a warrior's canvas. She looked at Theron, her king, her ally, and met his gaze. There was no submission in her eyes, no gratitude of a damsel rescued. There was only the fierce, unyielding look of a fellow victor, a partner who had waged and won her own war. He saw it, and a look of profound understanding and awe passed across his face. The dead king and his avenging bride reborn together in the crucible of a bloody throne room. The silence that fell upon the throne room was heavier than the weight of the dead. The last echoes of battle faded, replaced by the soft groans of the wounded and the sharp metallic scent of blood. The great tapestries were slashed, the marble floors were slick with crimson, and the opulent hall had become a tomb for a failed ambition. King Theron, his black armor streaked with grime and gore, stood tall amidst the wreckage. The mask of the fool was gone forever, replaced by the grim, resolute face of a king who had waded through blood to reclaim his throne. His commands were sharp, precise, and instantly obeyed. "General Kaelin, secure the palace. Every gate, every door. Arrest any who still show the silver and black of my uncle's legion. No one leaves the city walls until dawn. And the prisoners your majesty," Kaelin asked, his own sword still dripping. "The traitors who surrendered will be held for trial. As for the master of this farce." Theron's gaze fell upon his uncle. Lord Valerius, his fine clothes torn and his face bruised, was forced to his knees before the throne. He was in chains, but his eyes still blazed with a hateful, defiant fire. He looked from Theron to Elara, a sneer twisting his lips. "You," he spat at Elara, his voice a venomous rasp. "I forged you into a blade, and you buried yourself in my own back. I should have let your father kill you when I had the chance. Your mistake." Theron said, his voice cold, as the grave was thinking you could control a fire you did not understand. He looked down at the man who had haunted his every step since childhood. "You will be taken to the black cells of the citadel. You will live out your days in darkness, contemplating the throne you came so close to stealing. It is a mercy you do not deserve." As guards hauled the cursing, struggling Valerius away, a new silence descended. The remaining courtiers, those who had survived and had not been implicated, watched with a mixture of terror and awe. Their foolish, decadent king was gone. In his place stood a warrior, a strategist, a ruler of terrible and absolute power. His gaze then swept the room and found Elara. She had not moved. She stood apart from the carnage, a statue carved from ivory and blood. Her wedding gown was ruined, spattered with the dark stain of her father's life, and the stiletto was still held tightly in her hand, a grim scepter for a queen of a bloody court. The world seemed to fade away as Theron walked towards her. The chaos, the guards, the terrified nobles, all of it receded, until there were only the two of them, He stopped before her, his expression unreadable. He looked at the blood on her dress, at the dagger in her hand, and then into her eyes. He saw no madness there, no hysteria. He saw only a vast, chilling calm. Gently he reached out and took the dagger from her grasp. His fingers closed around hers, and the warmth of his touch was a shocking intrusion into the cold bubble of her reality. He did not speak. He simply held her hand and led her away from the hall of death, away from the staring eyes guiding her through the now silent corridors of the palace. He led her back to the solarium, the place where their true alliance had been forged. The sky to the east was beginning to soften the impenetrable black of night, giving way to the bruised purple and soft gray of the coming dawn. He released her hand and moved to a sideboard, pouring 2 goblets of water from a crystal carafe. He handed one to her. "The first casualty of war is the truth," he said, quietly breaking the silence. "And the second is innocence." He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, sorrowful understanding. "I am sorry you had to be a part of this, that I had to use you as I did." "We used each other," she replied, her voice hoarse. She took a sip of water, the coolness a balm to her raw throat. It was a partnership of necessity, nothing more. "Was it?" he asked, stepping closer. "When I lay on that floor and your scream echoed in my ears, it did not sound like the cry of a spy whose plan was succeeding. It sounded real. My terror was real." She admitted, her gaze fixed on the lightening horizon. "I believed for a moment that our plan had failed, that Valerius had outsmarted us, that you were truly dead." She finally turned to look at him, her violet eyes searching his. And in that moment I felt something I did not expect. I did not feel the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. I felt loss. He took another step, closing the distance between them. "My plan was flawed, Elara. I was so focused on the grand strategy, on trapping my uncle, that I nearly overlooked the most dangerous part of it, your safety. He would have killed you. After the coronation, after he had no more use for you, he would have disposed of you without a second thought. My victory would have been meaningless, built upon your grave." For the first time, all the masks were gone. He was not a king, and she was not a spy. They were 2 survivors standing in the wreckage of a world they had both helped to burn. And in the quiet space between them, a new, fragile and terrifying truth was beginning to form. "You are not the only one who has been keeping a secret, Theron," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She watched his face, knowing her next words would change everything forever. "When you reclaim your throne, you will also need to name your heir." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "That can wait. There is a kingdom to rebuild first." "No," she said, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "It cannot wait." She placed a hand still smudged with the grime of the battle over her abdomen. "Because I carry your heir." The world seemed to stop. The rising sun, the distant city, the very stars in the sky, all of it froze. Theron stared at her, then at her hand, his mind struggling to comprehend the magnitude of her words. Disbelief, shock, and then a wave of raw, unshielded emotion, so powerful it seemed to shake his very soul. He moved toward her, not with the confidence of a king, but with the hesitant reverence of a pilgrim approaching a sacred shrine. He knelt before her on the cold stone floor, looking up at her, his green eyes luminous with unshed tears. Slowly, as if asking permission, he reached out and placed his hand over hers on her stomach. An air, he breathed the word, a prayer, a new beginning. In that single profound moment, their entire relationship was reforged. All the lies, the manipulations, the strategic deceptions, they were burned away, leaving only this: a shared future. A child conceived in a world of shadows who would now be born into the light. He rose to his feet, his hands moving to gently cup her face. "The kingdom needs its rulers," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I have learned a harsh lesson. I cannot and should not rule it alone. For years I have sought a queen, a partner. But I was looking for the wrong qualities. I was looking for a dove, gentle and pure. I did not realize I needed a falcon with a warrior's heart and eyes that could see through the darkness." He looked at her, his gaze full of a respect and admiration that went deeper than any infatuation. "Elara Vance, you have the mind of a queen, the will of a conqueror, and the courage of a lioness. You have been forged in the blackest of fires, and you have emerged not broken, but tempered like the finest steel. Marry me. Not as my consort, a pretty prize to be displayed, but as my partner, as my queen. Rule with me. Let us build a new Ethel from these ashes together." Her mother's warning echoed a final faint time in her memory. Trust no man. It had been a shield, a necessary armor in a world that had tried to destroy her. But Theron was not her father. He was not Valerius. He had seen the weapon she had become, and he was not afraid. He was not asking her to lay down her sword, but to raise it and rule beside him. She looked at his earnest, open face at the dawn of a new day breaking over their city, and she made her final choice. She would not be ruled by the ghosts of the past. She would build a future. Yes, she whispered, yes. Epilogue. 3 years later, Queen Elara stood on that same balcony of the solarium, though it was no longer a place of secrets and shadows. It was a place of peace. The setting sun bathed the prosperous, bustling capital in a benevolent golden light. Ethel, under the joint rule of its king and queen, was thriving. A small hand tugged on her gown. She looked down into a pair of serious green eyes, so like his father's, set in a face that held all of her own determination. "Mama," Prince Aaron said, pointing a chubby finger toward the sky. "Star." "Yes, my love," Elara said, smiling as she swept her son into her arms. The first star of the evening. Theron came to stand behind them, wrapping his arms around them, both his chin resting on her hair. "He has your impatience," he murmured into her ear. "Always the first to see what is coming." "And he has your heart," she replied, leaning back against him, feeling the steady, familiar beat of it against her own. Her journey had been a trial by fire. The scars of her past would never truly fade. They were a part of who she was, a reminder of the price of their peace. But they were no longer chains. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, a pawn in a game of kings, and had emerged a queen in her own right. She had sought vengeance, and in the most unexpected of ways had found redemption, a purpose, and a love strong enough to rebuild a kingdom. Looking out at the horizon with her family in her arms, Elara Vance, the Serpent of Ethel, was finally truly home. Power. It is often said, is a game of thrones, of shifting loyalties and brutal ambitions. But perhaps true strength is not found in the crown one wears or the armies one commands. Perhaps it is found in the courage to trust when all trust has been broken, to build a future from the ashes of the past, and to recognize that the most powerful kingdom of all is the one built not by a single ruler, but by two hearts beating as one. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you believe that even in the darkest of tales, a lesson of hope and strength can be found, we invite you to subscribe to our channel. Please like this video if it moved you and share your thoughts in the comments below. We are all storytellers, and we look forward to sharing the next chapter with you.